Let me tell you something about South Park that 27 years of cultural debate has almost entirely missed. It is not primarily a show about shock value. It is not primarily a show about equal opportunity offense. It is not primarily a show about the specific targets of any given episode's satire. It is not even primarily a show about politics in the way that the discourse around it has always treated it. It is a show about moral psychology, about the specific mechanisms through which human beings disengage from their own moral frameworks and do things their stated values should prevent them from doing, about the specific social dynamics through which groups abandon independent judgment and produce collective behavior that none of the individuals would endorse alone, and about the specific and deeply uncomfortable way that children do not invent the worst of what they express. They absorb it from the adult world around them and reflect it back with a clarity that the adult world finds intolerable, precisely because the reflection is accurate. That is what Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been building in the town of South Park, Colorado for 27 years. And the social psychology research makes it more legible and more important than the cultural conversation has ever managed to treat it. Let's start with the foundational finding, the one that makes South Park psychologically coherent rather than simply transgressive. Albert Bandura's research on moral disengagement is the most important single framework for understanding what South Park is doing. Bandura, the same researcher whose social learning theory established the foundational understanding of how children learn through observation, spent decades studying a specific and troubling question. How do people with genuine moral values do things that violate those values without experiencing the psychological distress that violation should produce? His answer was moral disengagement, a set of specific cognitive mechanisms through which the normal self-regulatory processes, the conscience, the empathic response, the anticipated guilt, are selectively deactivated in specific contexts to allow behavior that the person's own moral framework would otherwise prevent. Bandura identified 8 specific mechanisms: moral justification, euphemistic labeling, advantageous comparison, displacement of responsibility, diffusion of responsibility, dehumanization, attribution of blame, distortion of consequences. South Park is a 27-season exploration of every single one of these mechanisms, applied to every possible domain of human behavior, by 4 10-year-old boys who are simultaneously the agents of moral disengagement and the mirrors in which the adult world's own moral disengagement is made visible. This is not accidental. Parker and Stone have been explicit that the show's central ambition is to expose the gap between what people believe about themselves and what they actually do, between the stated moral framework and the actual behavior, and Bandura's research is the most precise academic description of the mechanism through which that gap is produced and maintained. Here is the first moral disengagement mechanism that South Park explores most consistently: euphemistic labeling. The specific cognitive mechanism through which the language used to describe an action obscures its moral character and makes it possible to perform without triggering the moral self-regulation that accurate description would activate. The research on euphemistic labeling in real-world contexts, from the military language that converts killing into neutralizing to the corporate language that converts firing people into right-sizing, finds that the relationship between language and moral self-regulation is not metaphorical. It is mechanistic. The label through which an action is processed determines whether the moral regulatory system engages with it as a moral question or passes it through as a technical or neutral one. South Park's use of language, its specific, deliberate, often shocking refusal of euphemism, is not simply provocative. It is the specific reversal of the euphemistic labeling mechanism, where the real world uses sanitized language to make morally significant acts feel neutral. South Park uses blunt, unfiltered, often grotesque language to make acts that the culture has sanitized feel morally significant again. This is why the show's language offends in a way that is different from gratuitous offense. It is not simply replacing the polite word with the impolite word. It is removing the buffer that the polite word provides between the act and its moral reality. And the children, Eric Cartman specifically, are the vehicle through which this mechanism is explored most fully. Cartman says the things that the adult characters are thinking, but have wrapped in sufficient linguistic packaging to render them expressible in polite company. The child who has not yet learned the euphemisms is the child who says what is actually happening. Now let me talk about groupthink, because this is the second major social psychology framework that South Park deploys most consistently and most effectively. Irving Janis's foundational research on groupthink, developed from the analysis of catastrophic collective decision-making failures, including the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Pearl Harbor intelligence failures, identified a specific and dangerous psychological phenomenon: the cohesive group that prioritizes consensus over accurate assessment. That suppresses dissent not through explicit coercion, but through the implicit social pressure of the group's desire for unanimity. That develops an illusion of invulnerability, a collective rationalization of contrary evidence, a shared belief in the inherent morality of the group's positions, and a stereotyped view of outgroups that makes accurate assessment of their perspective impossible. South Park depicts this mechanism in almost every episode that involves the adult population of the town. The parents, the teachers, the community, converging on collective positions with a speed and a unanimity that parodies but does not fundamentally distort the specific social psychology of how groups actually form and sustain consensus. The research on conformity, Solomon Asch's landmark experiments, finding that a significant proportion of people will report an obviously incorrect answer when surrounded by Confederates reporting the same incorrect answer, is directly relevant. The South Park adult mob is a sustained depiction of Asch conformity applied to the entire range of social, political, and moral questions. The town converges because convergence is what cohesive social groups do, not because the convergent position is correct. And the children observe this. The children, Kyle's rationalism, Stan's occasional genuine moral clarity, even Cartman's cynical but accurate reading of adult social dynamics, function as the chorus that sees the groupthink for what it is. Not because children are wiser than adults, because they have not yet been fully socialized into the specific social pressure that makes conformity feel like consensus. Here is the piece about Eric Cartman that the research on moral disengagement and antisocial behavior makes most clinically significant. Cartman is the most psychologically complex character in the show, and the one whose portrait the research on the development of antisocial behavior illuminates most precisely. Cartman is not simply a bad child. He is a psychologically coherent portrait of a specific developmental presentation. The child with significant cognitive capability deployed entirely in the service of self-interest. The child whose capacity for perspective-taking, for modeling other people's mental states with accuracy, is fully developed but completely decoupled from the empathic response that normally makes that capacity costly to exploit. This is the cold empathy configuration we have discussed in the forensic psychology scripts, applied to a 10-year-old in a Colorado mountain town. The research on callous, unemotional traits in children, S.E. Vidding's foundational work on the precursors to psychopathic personality development, identifies a specific profile: high cognitive social intelligence, low affective empathy, the capacity to understand what other people feel without being moved by it. The specific combination that produces the most effective manipulator because the social model is accurate and the cost of exploitation is not felt. Cartman's mother is the developmental explanation the show consistently provides. The complete absence of boundaries, the refusal of any consequence, the specific parenting that the research on the development of callous, unemotional traits identifies as a contributing environmental factor. Not the sole cause. The research is clear that constitutional factors are significant, but the specific environmental amplifier of a constitutional predisposition. What the show does with Cartman that the clinical research supports is important. Cartman's intelligence is real. His social modeling is accurate. His reading of the adult world's hypocrisies is often the most precise in the show. The monster is not stupid. The monster sees clearly. And what it sees clearly it uses without the empathic break that makes most people reluctant to use what they see. Here is the research finding that is the most important for understanding what South Park is actually arguing as a show: the research on social learning and the intergenerational transmission of values. Albert Bandura's original social learning research and the subsequent developmental literature find something that South Park makes its central argument for 27 seasons. Children do not primarily learn values from explicit instruction. They learn from observation, from watching what the adults around them actually do, from absorbing the specific gap between the values adults profess and the behavior adults produce, and from internalizing not the professed values but the actual behavior as the true signal about what values the world actually operates on. The Bobo doll experiments. Bandura's foundational research demonstrating that children exposed to adult aggressive behavior reproduce that behavior at significantly higher rates than children not exposed to it is the methodological foundation for the observational learning research. But the implication of that research extends far beyond physical aggression. Children observe, they absorb, they model, and what they model is not what adults say, it is what adults do. South Park's children are performing a sustained, episode-length, season-long demonstration of this finding. Their behavior, the cruelty, the prejudice, the specific moral failures, is not invented. It is absorbed from the adult environment, from the parents who model the same prejudices in the language of adult respectability, from the teachers who model the same cruelty in the language of authority, from the media, the politicians, the community institutions that model the same groupthink in the language of consensus. The children are mirrors, saying clearly, without the packaging, what the adult world is saying with it. And the reason the show offends so consistently and so specifically is that the reflection is accurate. Let me talk about Kyle and Stan specifically, because these two characters represent the research on moral identity and moral courage in a way that the show's critics rarely acknowledge. Kyle is the show's moral center, not a perfect moral center. The show is too psychologically honest for that. But a character who consistently attempts genuine moral reasoning in an environment that consistently resists it, who argues for the accurate position, who names what is happening when the groupthink has produced a collective delusion. The research on moral identity. Augusto Blasi's foundational work on the relationship between moral reasoning and moral action finds that the person for whom moral values are central to their self-concept is more likely to act in accordance with those values even under social pressure. Kyle's consistent moral dissent is the depiction of this finding, the character for whom being right matters more than fitting in. Stan represents something slightly different. The research on moral disengagement and passive complicity, the specific phenomenon of the person who knows the group is wrong, who disagrees internally, but who does not act on that disagreement, maps onto Stan's recurring dynamic. The moral witness who does not always become the moral actor, and the research on the psychology of the bystander, Darley and Latané's foundational work on the bystander effect, is relevant here. Stan's passive complicity in Cartman's schemes, his consistent failure to intervene until the consequences are already catastrophic. This is not a character flaw in the simple sense. It is the specific psychology of the good person in a social system that makes acting on goodness socially costly. Here is where I want to land. South Park is not the show that most people think it is when they argue about it. The people who defend it as equal opportunity satire are not wrong, but they are describing the surface. The people who condemn it as gratuitous shock value are not entirely wrong either. The shock value is real, but they are missing what the shock value is in service of. What South Park has been in service of for 27 seasons is the most consistent, sustained application of social psychology research to popular culture that television has ever produced. The moral disengagement mechanisms, the groupthink dynamics, the social learning of behavior from observation rather than instruction, the specific ways that children absorb and reflect the adult world's actual values rather than its stated ones. These are the findings of Bandura, of Janice, of Ash, of Blasi, of Darley, and Latané, applied week after week to every available target without the protective packaging that serious treatment of serious research usually requires. The show is offensive because the research is offensive, because what the social psychology of human moral behavior actually finds about how we treat each other, how we form groups, how we disengage from our own values to do what we want to do anyway, is not comfortable. And Parker and Stone decided 27 years ago that the most honest way to show it was through the mouths of 4 10-year-old boys in a small Colorado mountain town, who say exactly what they see, because no one has yet taught them not to. If this video changed how you think about a show you thought you already understood, please like it and subscribe to the channel. These psychological deep dives are what this channel is built for, and every like and every subscription helps this research reach the people who need it most.